What's up, Internet? Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead, and today I'm excited to report back my results on my no water bochet. That's right, I did a fruit bomb and a bochet in one brew. I called it Black Dragon's Bomb. Some of you may have seen a gif of this floating around on Reddit or Discord, but I submitted it to Mead Stampede 2022 and the results are in. In the experimental category, the first judge gave this 35 points and the second judge 40 points, for an average of 37.5 points total. This is an extremely solid and respectable score in its own right, which I'm excited enough about. But more importantly, this proves that a bochet fruit bomb is possible. Yeah. Now, I haven't been able to find any record of anyone doing a bochet fruit bomb elsewhere on the internet. I'm sure somebody's done it somewhere out there, but I couldn't find it. So I'm hoping that you guys will find this just as intriguing of a process and a recipe as I did. Without further ado, let's get in it. Black Dragon's Bomb is a fruit bomb iteration of the recipe that kicked off my entire channel, Black Dragon's Blood, which itself is a variation of the Danger Dave Dragon Blood wine recipe. All told, the foundational core of this recipe is the triple berry blend bags you can get at your local freezer aisle. I get mine from Costco. These frozen mixed berry bags are fairly widespread, and they tend to be available year-round because they're frozen, and cheaper than most of their non-frozen counterparts. On top of that, freezing before fermenting is considered a good practice because it helps break down the cell walls and makes it a little bit easier for the yeast to get in there and do their thing. So not only is it cheaper, but it's convenient to buy frozen fruit. And then in the spirit of getting Costco fruit, I decided to go all the way Costco and get their wildflower honey as well, making this effectively a Costco-mel fruit bomb. Mostly, anyway. I've really enjoyed making fruit bomb meads. It's my favorite style by far, and also the one that I've enjoyed the most success with. The Marionberry mead that I took second place with in the fruit category of the 2021 Mead Stampede competition was also a fruit bomb. And in my early days of brewing, Black Dragon's Blood was my favorite custom recipe. Although as a point of comparison, the last iteration I did of Black Dragon's Blood only scored 22.5 points in Mead Stampede. Not nearly as well. So it seemed only natural that I should try to elevate that recipe by combining it with something I've had a lot more success with: no water meads. Doing this as a Costco-mel seemed like it might be a good way to make the fruit bomb a little more accessible to brewers who've been intimidated by the no water category, and the fact that I had to bochet some of the honey to pull this off introduced just the right amount of crazy for me. That brings us to the recipe. For primary, I used 24 pounds of Costco's triple berry blend, blueberry, blackberry, and raspberry, 15 total pounds of Costco's wildflower honey, 10 of which I bochetted and 5 of which I left normal, 20 grams of Lalvin 71B, which is a staple go-to yeast for fruit bombs, 2.5 teaspoons of pectic enzyme, and 5 teaspoons of bentonite. Now remember, as a fruit bomb, this is a no water mead, so that's all there is to it. In secondary, I back sweetened with 2 pounds of orange blossom honey, 4 cups of brown sugar, and I also soaked this on a pound of cocoa nibs for 3 days, and 1 teaspoon of black pepper for 5 days, not simultaneously. My original Black Dragon's Blood recipe used coffee and bourbon instead of cocoa, but I found that coffee can be weirdly divisive and polarizing. I know a statistically improbable number of people who don't drink coffee, and most people who don't drink coffee really don't drink coffee, which means if I brew with it, I'm cutting the number of friends and family I can share with like in half. On the other hand, practically everybody loves chocolate. There's nothing stopping me from introducing bourbon in this recipe, but the main reason I included it originally was to fortify the coffee up to the same ABV as the brew itself, so that when I added the coffee in secondary, I did not dilute the ABV and risk restarting fermentation. And the original brew was also lightly fruited, whereas this one is a fruit bomb. I was pretty sure the bourbon needed to sit this one out to make space in the brew for other flavors that were going to get cranked up to 11. And ultimately, I think that turned out to be the right call. As far as nutrition on this brew is concerned, keep in mind that although we do not normally rely on natural sources of nitrogen in modern mead making, fruit bombs have so much fruit in them that they become the exception to the rule. You will only use Fermaid K and diammonium phosphate on fruit bombs under the assumption that there is enough fruit to cover the natural sources of nitrogen required. I'll link a video for you guys where Storm Before Dawn explains nutrition in fruit bombs in much more detail. But as far as this video goes, I'll keep it a little lighter and just say I was targeting 226 ppm yan and wound up using Go Firm by package instructions, 7.75 grams of Fermade K and 12.7 grams of diammonium phosphate. The Fermade K and DAP were both split over 2 additions, one at 24 hours and the other at 48 hours. No water meads can ferment very quickly, so I would not recommend using a standard nutrition schedule that spreads the additions out over a longer period of time than that. Remember, yeast cannot metabolize DAP past about 9% ABV. If you don't get those nutrients in there quick enough, it won't be used, and unused diammonium phosphate can cause off flavors. That brings us to the process, which for a bochet fruit bomb is the best part. To start, we need to defrost the berries so that they're fluid enough to mix with the bochet honey. And one of the cool things about this batch is that it actually fits in a 5-gallon bucket, which I think is another thing that makes it even more accessible to a wider range of homebrewers than some of the other fruit bombs that require huge fermenters. To help protect the berries while they're warming up, I actually put a solid lid on the bucket since I had one on hand, although if you don't, no worries, an airlock or even an upturned coffee mug placed over a paper towel over the airlock hole should do the job just as well. Now, depending on the ambient temperature in your area, there's a good chance that defrosting a 24-pound pile of frozen berries will take at least 24 hours, possibly longer. Once your berries have become fluid enough to pour, you can bochet your honey. How dark you take this is ultimately up to you. I've been told that even practically burnt honey develops great flavor and complexity as it ages, but the darker you take the honey, the longer it'll have to age. And remember, I submitted this to Mead Stampede when it was already over a year old, and while it scored great, this is a good time to mention some of the points it lost were due to the bochet flavors still overwhelming the fruit flavors. And this is a fruit bomb here. The fruit flavors should be pretty off the charts and extremely difficult to overwhelm. So again, bochet to your preferred level of darkness, but remember, when I say a dark bochet will need time to age, I mean you could be looking at 3 to 5 years. Once you have finished the bochet process, you want the honey to cool down quite a bit because this next step could get a little dicey with really hot honey, but not so much that it hardens. For the record, I've never actually seen more than like a drop of honey harden, but I'm told it can happen and those drops definitely do harden, so just to be safe, keep an eye on it as it cools. Then you have to pour your berries over that bochet honey. Now, keep in mind that I have a 5-gallon kettle for caramelizing my honey, and this entire batch fits in a 5-gallon fermenter. So I have room to pour all of my berries in here and then mix them up in a steel pot where I can be a little bit more aggressive with the stirring and the utensils I use to do it. Although no longer frozen solid, my berries were still cold. And although no longer boiling, my honey was still hot. So when everything mixed together, the must leveled out at a respectable and pitchable 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But be very careful. Even if you let it cool for a while first, that honey will still easily be hot enough to burn you. I might give this part of the process a little more thought before I attempt it again. I could, for example, try pouring the bochet honey over the berries next time. I was worried keeping the honey hot enough to pour onto the berries would be even more dangerous than the way I ended up doing it, and also worried the extreme heat could damage the flavor profile of some of the fruit or even the plastic of the bucket. Honestly, I haven't made up my mind yet how I'm going to handle this next time. Let me know down in the comments what you think, and seriously, please be careful with this part if you try it at home. Boiling hot honey is a legitimate burn risk. After that, I added the remaining 5 pounds of wildflower honey that I had not caramelized, mixed that up real well, then I poured the must back into the 5-gallon bucket I was going to use as a fermenter. I rehydrated my yeast with Go Firm. I had no idea how long it would take my must to reach a pitchable temperature, so I didn't prepare it ahead of time on this brew, but once that was done rehydrating, I pitched my yeast, slapped the lid on with an airlock, and called it good. Nutrient additions went in, like I said earlier, at 24 hours, and again at 48. I know I often say you guys can just do whatever nutrient schedule you prefer here, but like I said earlier, I do recommend you use this specific schedule for fruit bombs. After the second nutrient addition goes in, I continued punching the fruit cap down and mixing up the must for the remainder of the first week. At the end of the first week comes the part that always makes me nervous. You just let it sit for 3 more weeks. Keep the lid on for these 3 weeks. It limits exposure to the air, which can introduce things that you very much do not want at this point in the process, like oxygen and mold spores. Many of you are probably familiar with Corey, who's appeared on the Doing the Most channel before, and is probably the most knowledgeable person I know of when it comes to no water meads. and 4 weeks total on the fruit skins for tannin development has been his standard recommendation on pretty much every fruit bomb I've asked him about. Too much longer than that, and you do start to risk mold developing on the cap. But if you do it for much less time than that, you may not get enough tannin extraction and development. In following Corey's 4-week rule, I have not yet had a mold problem on any of my fruit bombs. Cross my fingers, knock on wood, and they've all been much better balanced than any of the other meads I've done, so the tannin extraction is really important. I racked at that 4-week mark, and yes, I did press. Pressing is always an interesting choice with fruit bombs because you will get a lot more tannins and sediment, but also a lot more product. Without pressing, no water meads are notorious for poor yields. In the past, I've suggested that you could keep pressed and free run products separate and blend them to taste after the fact. I do still think that's a very good idea, although in practice it can be tedious to execute, so in this one I just racked it all together. My pressing process, by the way, doesn't rely on any fancy vintner equipment. I just rack as much of the free run mead as I can before pouring the berries that are left over into a brew bag, like you would use for brew in a bag, and then I squeeze the ever-living shit out of it. Repeat until you've pressed all the berries, and pray that you finish your pressing before your forearms erupt in a blaze of burning agony. Oh, and you probably want to sanitize your hands and/or wear gloves and sanitize your gloves for this part. I let this meld for a couple of months and settle out some of the initial sediment, which is quite a bit, especially since I pressed. And I do rack off of this sediment. I generally don't think you need to rack a whole bunch. I think most homebrewers are a little trigger happy when it comes to racking, especially new brewers that don't have a ton of experience. But I have tasted this fruit sediment, and it's gross. I think it's mostly fruit remnants. It actually doesn't taste very yeasty to me, but not in a good way. It still tastes pretty awful, and I don't want my mead sitting on it for an extended period of time. Also, racking at this stage allows me to consolidate down to fewer carboys. Getting off the sediment allowed me to collect about 3 gallons of clean product that was going to be pretty solid for aging, and at that point I was down to a single carboy. A couple days later, I introduced a pound of cocoa nibs. I racked off those nibs about 48 hours later. That may not seem like a super long time, but a friend and I checked in on the mead and agreed the chocolate was strong in the aroma and decidedly present in the palate. And I didn't want to overdo the chocolate, so I called it there. That said, we also felt this needed to be sweeter to support that chocolate flavor, so I bench trialed back sweetening with each of the honey varietals I had in stock at the time: orange blossom, clover, and pumpkin blossom honey. Orange blossom proved to be far and away the best by unanimous agreement, so I added 2 pounds of it when I racked off the cocoa nibs and tried to let the racking process perform a lot of the gentle mixing for me so that I could limit oxygen exposure as much as possible. That said, 2 pounds of honey was what happened when I attempted to sweeten to taste for the very first time, instead of picking a somewhat arbitrary target gravity and then using a calculator to figure out how much honey I needed to add. I ended up sweetening this to 1098, which is insanely high for a final gravity in my opinion. This is the sweetest thing I've ever brewed. Not long after this, I realized I forgot to take, or perhaps forgot to write down, a gravity measurement before back sweetening. I tried to work backwards and calculate what my gravity should have been post-fermentation and came up with just about 1080. That's quite high as well, and a little alarming because it would indicate an ABV of 10.62%. That is the shortest I've ever come up with while using 71B, which should be able to hit 14% and almost always goes above and beyond that if there's still available sugar to eat. I'm not entirely sure how that happened, but this mead is so thick that my mini-jet actually can't handle it. Within seconds it starts blowing out its filter pads, so it's possible that my hydrometer just isn't working very well on it. That would explain why it doesn't taste like it's almost 1.1 final gravity to me, although I've also heard some folks complaining about fermentation issues on bouchets, especially really dark ones, so it's hard for me to say. I'm sorry I don't know for sure, but I think you guys know I prefer to give you a more repeatable and scientific description. But that's all I got on this one. Either way, I came back to this mead almost a year later for more finishing and balancing. I ended up adding a teaspoon of freshly ground black peppercorns in a tea bag and let them sit for 5 days. Taste testing frequently because you can easily over pepper a mead if you're not careful. At the point I removed the pepper, the mead could have handled more. So if pepper's your jam, keep in mind you could crank it up a lot more in a brew like this. But for me, I didn't really want it to be just a pepper mead. I figured there were probably cheaper ways to do a pepper-focused mead. I wanted pepper to help balance things out. My partner and I also agreed in taste testing that Even after a year, the boucher was too aggressive. And I know I said it was crazy sweet already, but we added 4 cups of brown sugar. Yes, if the 1098 final gravity from earlier is accurate, that will have taken the final gravity on this mead over 1.1. The last change that we made to this mead before submitting was topping off the headspace, which was starting to get a little low from all the different bench trials it had gone through in the past year. We ended up topping it off with a spiced sicer that my partner made. It features clove, cinnamon, and a small plethora of less prominent supporting ingredients. This mead was chosen for headspace filler in the hopes that it would blend well into the background. It's a little difficult to explain how you pick a mead for that kind of blending, but basically you're looking for something that can complement the main brew, dilute the harsh edges, and avoid detracting from any of the desirable components, and avoid becoming the dominant portion of the tasting experience. This sicer did fill that role perfectly. It helped to just polish up the mead without fundamentally changing its identity. And that catches us up to the state of the mead when we submitted to Mead Stampede, where we scored, like I said, an average of 37.5 points. 35 from the first judge and 40 from the second. Bouquet and aroma was described as fruity, cherry, chocolate, dark toffee, caramel, honey. The judges used fairly different descriptors, and there was a significant difference in the amount of honey and alcohol detected in the aroma by the 2 judges, but they both detected medium complexity and no off aromas or fermentation funk. Appearance was a fairly objective description of what it looks like, which I can show you guys fine on video. The legs indicate significant extract. It's so dark, it's opaque, with reddish brown hues. One judge felt it was a tiny bit murky as opposed to just dark, which would indicate a little more clearing to go, and that's totally possible. I submitted it shortly after adding both more brown sugar and spices. The flavor was described as chocolate and cherry by both judges, though curiously one thought the chocolate was bitter while the other thought it was rich. This section suggests to me that the thickness of my mead may have interfered with the hydrometer's ability to read the residual sugar accurately. I'm not 100% certain that's even a thing, but one judge rated the sweetness just a little above the midline. If it's actually over 1.1 gravity worth of residual sugar, I have a hard time imagining the judges not both capping out the sweetness on this brew. Although the bochet is pretty dark for being only a year old, so it's entirely possible there is a lot of bitterness from the young bochet interfering with the rest of the balance. Either way, in closing feedback, both judges agreed the flavor profile was a little muddied. Too many strong flavors all competing rather than complementing each other. In a follow-up on Discord, one judge told me he felt the bochet had overwhelmed the fruit flavors. That feedback, on top of the fact that both judges thought this was a cherry mead, I didn't declare the fruit I used because I didn't want to bias their tasting notes, makes me think that in addition to probably going a little lighter on the bochet next time, I will also try to pick a single fruit to really dial in the clarity of that flavor profile. With that said, in reviewing the feedback here, I am focusing on what could be done better. 37.5 is a great score. And what I take away from these results is that if you want to brew a no-water mead or a bochet fruit bomb, you both can and should do it. If you're thinking of trying a no-water mead and you haven't pulled the trigger yet due to some combination of budget and space constraints, you should seriously consider doing something like this. You won't have to save up several $100s to order 40 plus pounds of frozen fruit from a restaurant supplier online. And you don't have to live near a farm that's willing to sell you over 40 pounds of their harvest. At 4 pounds a piece, this recipe took 6 frozen berry bags. It fit in one 5-gallon bucket fermenter, and it yielded about 3 gallons of product in the end. I think you could also clean up the fermentation and flavor profile while dramatically reducing the time required to age it if you lightly bochet the honey or skip the bochet entirely, although that's less exciting. And for those of you who are here because you wanted to find out, can you do a bochet fruit bomb? The answer is yes, you absolutely can. 37.5 points on the first attempt. Guys, this is proof of concept. So if you're in either of those camps, a brewer who's felt no water meads were out of reach until now, or a brewer who's done one too many fruit bombs and is looking for a way to mix it up with the bochet honey, guys, I think this is the result you needed to see. And I hope you think so too. Please let me know down in the comments if you pull the trigger on this or any similar recipe, and let me know how it goes for you. Other than that, just remember, err on the side of keeping this in the carboy, especially if you bochet some of your honey, until you're satisfied with the taste. If you are not satisfied with the mead yet, don't bottle it and pray for age to fix it for you. Keep it in the carboy and verify that age does fix it, or that it doesn't, and then find a way to balance and polish the mead yourself. Anyway, this has been Jordan from Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again.
'Cause I'm still looking for the answers, and I'm calling out for you to tell me how to live. I want to live